women's status in society had incrementally grown throughout the early part of the 20th century, and that it seemed like every conflict, as wars tend to do, there's like an express way to elevation of certain things, whether it be technology or in this case women's roles. It's overlooked oftentimes, women's contributions to World War One in the factories. We always picture that as a World War II image, the women with the handkerchiefs on their heads and tooling away at a plane or something like that. But that was World War One as well. Nursing became a huge, that became actually a more considered a woman's job as a result of World War One and the Spanish flu pandemic. Double that, if not triple that, with World War II. Women having all of these responsibilities, and then also, to a certain degree, being involved a little bit closer to combat than they ever had. Both of the world wars left indelible marks on American society, the proof of which can be seen in the popular culture of the periods following each conflict. This is the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, the show where we use pop culture to learn about history. Two movies made within 10 years of each other, both by the same director and with similar overall themes, are the topics for this episode. I have Johan from Instagram's Edutainment Daily on hand to discuss our main topic, Victor Fleming's 1948 historic epic Joan of Arc, which is the last film entry into Fleming's storied career. But first, we're going back to this summer when I spoke to Greta, a cast member of Prescott Park's production of Little Shop of Horrors, about Fleming's 1939 masterpiece, The Wizard of Oz. Most of the cast are people such as yourself that are, this is what you're doing. It's not just like a fun community theater type thing. This is like part of what
I believe every single one of us are studying or have studied theater in some capacity.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing it. Yeah. And I'm also glad that you chose from my table of stuff, and I brought this for this reason because I love talking to Wizard of Oz. Mm-hmm. I all the classes I teach, I bring it up all the time. It's not my favorite movie, but I think it's the greatest movie ever made. I think it's perfect. And it set the tone in so many ways. And my wife would be so happy I said that because it's her favorite movie. Where does it fit in your kind of like pantheon of films?
Oh, it holds a special place in my heart. I was born to be a theater kid. I would make my siblings put on performances of different movies in my living room with me,
nice.
And I would play the leads, of course. And
it's very Joe March of you from Little Women.
That's
yes.
And The Wizard of Oz was one that we did very, very often. I would watch it all the time, and I just loved Dorothy so much. So it's near and dear, I would say. Yeah.
I think it's the ultimate, because like I'm a teacher. And I show it in a lot of my classes. At least something about Wizard of Oz finds its way in most of the things I teach. And one of the things that the book 1900, L. Frank Baum, gets a lot of attention from economists and economic historians because they are just entranced with the populist bimetallism component to it, which I'm pretty sure L. Frank Baum he said over and over again, no, it wasn't meant to be about that. But, he had that was, and it just proves the point of what I do for this podcast. I'm like, even if it wasn't intended for that, he had no choice but to include it because it was just all around him. That was like the political feeling of the 1890s was, what should we do with this money, system? And, so I think sometimes those people go off the deep end with their analysis of it. And the movie, of course, retains some of it. It has a yellow brick road. It gets rid of it right away, though, with Dorothy's ruby slippers.
Yes, not being silver.
Right.
Yeah.
So the silver gold thing, that makes a lot more sense. And so people are like, oh, how can you still say this movie is historically valuable? I'm like, yeah, but think about when it was actually made.
Yes.
The 30s.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of 30s in this movie. So the question I put before you is, what's it made out of? How is it made? Where do you see the 1930s in The Wizard of Oz?
Yeah, well, just going off of your point, I fully agree that art cannot exist without the politics of its time. As a political science and theater major, it's something that I think about quite often. And that's also the political influence within the Wizard of Oz is something we talked about in my AP US history class when I took it in high school.
So I'm doing a good job, yeah.
And I don't remember everything from that class, but I do remember talking about that. So I think there are definitely influences of these things. I mean, even thinking about just like Oz as a concept, this place where everybody is affluent and these aren't things that our characters are used to, and so they come to this place and they get everything that they want because they have these like resources and this glory and all of that. And like the wizard, he comes to Oz from Kansas, I believe. He's also from Kansas, and he gets to be this like rich person in Oz where he wouldn't get to at home because it's like you said, the 1930s, and things aren't looking so good for everybody.
So you're an actor, so I think you'll appreciate this. I have a theory that because the original story, people are like, again, if they're over symbolizing, like everything has a symbol to it, they always say Oz, the city, is Washington, and the Wizard of Oz is the president. And they're like Coxey's army going to appeal to the president, which did happen in the 30s. The bonus army marched on Washington, and throughout the not just 1932, but throughout the 30s, they kept coming back and back and back, asking for their bonus. But I actually have a theory that Oz in the movie represents California and Hollywood, because it's the wizard himself is played by the same guy that she meets down by the river, and he's like a failed entertainer.
Yes.
And he's the one that kind of is trying to dissuade her from leaving home. Because, I mean, California had a lot of promise in the 30s, not just for people who want to make it in show business, although that was like, you go to the movie theater and you're like, wow, this would be easy money. I just go out there, make a couple movies, and I'm, a millionaire. I can make it. Not that easy, but they didn't know that. Necessarily. And also it was the promise of fertile fields, and farmhands from the Dust Bowl could get work in California. Again, didn't necessarily come out to be true for everyone, but here's Dorothy. She wants to leave home. She's sick of Kansas, sick of the Dust Bowl, because that's 1930s, that's what was happening. And she heads out to Hollywood despite this guy's warnings. He's like, don't go it, but whirlwind just kind of plops her there. And, the wizard himself is kind of like a producer. He's like, yeah, I'll give you everything you want, but at first, you got to do a favor for me. You got to go take care of my enemy. Again, I don't want to get too steeped in symbols, because I think when you do that, it's kind of like, have you seen the live action Beauty and the Beast that they did? When she picks up the mirror and she's like, and what's your name? They're like, well, not everything here's alive,
Yeah. So
I don't want to be like that, but I feel like given the time period and everything going on around it, it's almost like it's Hollywood telling the rest of the country, like, yes, we actually are this shallow.
Yeah.
Think about the song they sing when they get to Oz.
Yes.
Like we wake up at noon and
start to work at 1 take
and
an hour for lunch, and then
and like, can you dye my eyes to match my gown? Like, yeah, of course, we do that all the time out here, because we're so vain. We don't care. I also think that there's an interwar feeling in there as well, especially with the No Place Like Home monologue at the very end, when she's like, it was beautiful, and I thought, but I just said I want to go home, and it's like, World War I vets telling everybody else, like, because there's another war on the horizon in Europe. Maybe, this might not be our trip. But what else about the 30s might be kind of hidden in plain sight in The Wizard of Oz?
Well, I'm going off of your theory that at least in the movie, Oz is representative of Hollywood. I think that even ties back to what we were talking about before with the decision to change the slippers from silver to ruby.
Yeah.
Because it was, film history, it was because things were transitioning to Technicolor.
Yeah.
They were like, silver's not going to be enough for
nobody's going to be impressed by that.
The spectacle of it all. They have to be something different. So the choice for the slippers to be ruby, I think, even reflects pop culture and the sensationalization. Is that a word?
It is now.
There we go. just like all of that, and Hollywood as a symbol.
Yeah, it's just kind of like as this great, and I don't, as an actor, do you feel that way about Hollywood now, or has it diminished a bit?
It's an interesting question, especially considering the strikes that are ongoing now. I think it's not really something I've given much thought to.
I'm sure if we could talk about those. Are we violating some kind of union rule or something?
I don't think so. I'm not in the union. I don't know. But I don't even know where I was going with that thought.
But I mean, is it because in the 30s, Hollywood had become that monolithic, this is where movies are made.
Yes.
And it basically gotten that title because of geography, because beautiful sunshine all the time. You can make movies. You don't have to, it was Edison was making them in the Black Maria, like just had to turn the entire building to get the sunlight, to come in New Jersey. You make it in Southern California, it's like this all the time.
Yeah.
Beautiful sunlight. You get all, you can shoot outside all the time, no rain, but also you can't get any further away from Washington and still be in the country where all the copyrights to those stories and the machinery that they're using are being held. They can't enforce it in Hollywood. So by the 30s, that's why Hollywood was doing so well, is because they hold all the movies. That's where they're made. You can't make them anywhere else. So now that 100 years later, it's all kind of dispersed all over the country.
Yes.
Like if you have aspirations to make movies,
you can do it wherever you want.
Go to Atlanta. You can go to,
you can go to Atlanta. You could be based in Boston, New York. You can be submitting to things virtually. You could live at home. I could live here in New Hampshire and still go somewhere and make a movie if they wanted me.
Yeah.
If I auditioned and got in and stuff
Syracuse,
like that.
Syracuse, New York actually has there's a company that bought an old middle school.
Wow.
And it's called All American High. And they make movies, a lot of school-related movies, but they have other sets in this old school, and that's pretty close.
That's
actually.
Very
cool. I mean, if they can make a Hollywood in Central New York, then why not anywhere? So in some ways, it's kind of, it's Hollywood. It's not the symbol that it used to be.
Yeah.
And so they have made the Wizard of Oz since then a couple times.
Many versions of it. I mean, even within theater, we have Wicked, which is based on a book, which is like a prologue to the Wizard of Oz. So I feel like the story is really branched out a lot for new generations too. And
that's almost, to wrap things up, that's exactly what L. Frank Baum, I think, wanted. If you ever take a look at the introduction of the Wizard of Oz, the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, he said, because it's 1900, and he said, gone are the old fairy tales. We need a new, our new country. We need a new story, new fairy tales, new lessons for our children for the future. And I think somebody actually said about the Wizard of Oz, it's the most accurate depiction of Midwestern life.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, despite all the magical things that happen in it, but the way that it portrays how people live there, is very accurate and very relatable. Like it gave agency to, people in the middle part of the country that up until that point, nobody even listened to what they had to say. So it's like, here's our story, kind of thing. So I think he'd be very glad actually to know that all of the stories and, from Wicked to, what was that one with James Franco?
Oh my gosh,
Oz the Great and Magnificent or something like that.
Whatever it was, I saw it.
Yeah, Mila Kunis was in it, and all that kind of business is all. And Star Wars, the original Star Wars, is very much another take on the Wizard of Oz. There's a lot of similarities there, and The Wiz came out around that time too, and so it's like, it's a story that continues on and on and on in so many different ways.
It's even referenced in the new Barbie movie.
Is it really?
It is.
I've yet to see that. My wife's going to go see it in a couple of days, and I'm interested. I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
It seems like a different take on a Toy Story type.
Yeah,
Is it good?
It is very good. Yeah, I think it's very accessible to multiple generations, kind of like we were talking about with the Wizard of Oz. I think there's audiences for it in all different ages.
Awesome. So I'm going to look into that too, because I love metafiction. I like that idea of, and what I see from the trailer anyways, it seems like she has to make a decision as to kind of like reverse Wizard of Oz, where she's going into the real world instead of the fantasy world.
Yeah.
That's cool. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah,
I really
of course,
appreciate
it's
it.
great.
And look forward to seeing you in Little Shop of Horrors coming up in a little bit.
Hope you enjoy.
I did end up seeing the Barbie movie and enjoyed it thoroughly, and also saw a lot of Wizard of Oz in that film. I want you to check out everythinghistory.com. That is the home of this podcast, as well as where you'll find all of the information you need to know about my consulting and coaching services. You can pick up links to all of my socials, including Instagram and YouTube, at everything-history.com. The Wizard of Oz began filming in October of 1938, which was roughly 3 years before the United States entered World War II. 10 years later, on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1948, the film Joan of Arc was released, in New York anyway. This date marks a little more than 3 years after the end of World War II. These films, and let's not forget that Victor Fleming directed the bulk of Gone with the Wind, which was released in 1939, soon after The Wizard of Oz. These films collectively have quite a bit in common. All three tell the story of strong, or at least strong-willed, young women who undertake a quest which sees their trials and triumphs transform them into a much different person from the start of the film. What's interesting is that most people have at least heard of The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, even if they've never seen them, because of the huge impression the films made in their era just before the world changed. Joan of Arc, on the other hand, does not get nearly the same amount of attention as the director's earlier stories, despite its similar tropes. Johan and I discussed this concept and much more in today's dissection. Johan, it's good to have you back. Thanks for joining the Everything is a Primary Source podcast, and you're the host. I guess we'll call it host, or basically you are Edutainment Daily on Instagram. Correct?
That would be me, yes.
Yeah. Before we jump into our topic for today, could you just tell me a little bit about where do you get your inspiration for your topics when you make your videos on Instagram?
It can come from so many places, but like half of the time it's from work. I work as a teacher. I teach history for what would be upper high school in the US. So when researching my lectures there, I find so much interesting stuff that doesn't quite fit in the curriculum, what I have to bring up, but that I do want to talk about. And that's what I put on the Edutainment Daily account.
And it's a nice, I like it a lot because for that very reason, because I think that a lot of teachers could probably use what you have as like classroom starters. Just here's a little fact and get things going, with a particular topic. Do you hear back from teachers that they use it that way?
A few teachers, but I do also hear back a lot from my students that they are watching it and they can bring up on like the next class that, hey, I watched your video about this thing. Do you want to talk a bit more about it? So it's a great way for them to like grow the interest in history.
Yeah. And I think that this is, and the same kind of goes with my podcast. Like this just demonstrates to people that you can do more with history than just teach it. That there is a lot of content creation that can be made. And our topic for today underscores that as well, because we're going to be discussing the 1948 movie Joan of Arc. And I always have the question that comes up in my mind when a movie and, with the whole apparatus necessary to make a movie, when the decision is made, we're going to tell a story about history. We're going to take something from the annals of time, and we're going to put it onto the big screen for people to watch and enjoy and maybe learn something from. The same reason, while you and I might find something either scouring the internet or just flipping the pages of a textbook or something and saying, oh yeah, I want to go more into that. The same kind of impulse, I guess, has to go with making a movie, particularly an epic film about the past. Originally, we're going to go with King Kong, but what is it about the movie Joan of Arc from 1948 that you said that's the one we got to talk about that?
Well, there are two things. First off, when I started to think of what we should talk about, I looked into Joan of Arc as a historical, not a historical figure, but a historical concept, because she is one of the most used historical figure in any pop culture. Going back, they wrote plays about her the years after she died. While she was alive, they published poems about her. And from that time, the late 15th century, until today, there have been published more than like 100 theater plays, almost 100 movies now. There's so much, and that's very interesting. And second off, we could start with that.
No, I think that's when we hear the term pop culture, we tend to apply it only to the 20th century because that's the pop culture that we're most familiar with, and that's the era of mass media really just growing in size by the minute, it seemed. But you're right, anything that is like a shared or arrived at thing for a larger than like a village size of people, we can consider the pop culture. And so, France is a country that has had a lot of popular culture dating all the way back. I would put it as early as like Charlemagne, as being like the original pop culture icon of, and France has in its, they kind of have their own pantheon in a way. All of their archives and in the capital, their statues and all these different people. And and I think you got to really emphasize that part of it too. It's a she that's gravitated towards, and that's something that early feminism, 15th century feminism, comes up here too. So, she is a pop culture icon that has existed for, like you said, centuries now. We're over 500 years since her life, very short life, and she was killed. And what was the other thing that drew you to this? And I think I might know, but go ahead and explain.
No, it's she's being played by Ingrid Bergman. Plays a great part in the movie, and that's a Swedish actress. So obviously that brings me, brings the interest from me to it. She has such an interesting story in herself, moving from Sweden to the US, being not treated very well in Hollywood at times, moving over to Italy and then back. She has a very interesting story.
And her legacy lives on through her children. I think the one that tends to, a lot of people don't realize, is her daughter is Isabella Rossellini. And then her daughter beyond that is also in acting. So it's almost like a dynasty of acting.
And we do have a few of them in Sweden, like the Skarsgårds and as well.
And so she, and I'm glad that you said her name as it's pronounced in Swedish, or more, because in the US it has much more harder sound. Is Ingrid Bergman, everything is that much more harsh in its pronunciation. But she's an icon, and how does this film factor into her iconic status? Because this isn't the first time that she played the character, is it?
No, and the interesting thing is that this is one of her lesser known works, this movie. When looking at a summary of her life, most people don't even bring this one up. It's way more important for Fleming, the producer, because this is his last movie, right?
Yes, it turns out to be his last one.
Yeah, but for Bergman, it's more of she's on her way out from the American scene, and it doesn't really get much attention in Sweden or in Europe at all. I'm not sure how much attention it got in the US, but over here it's like a little. It just plays a little part in her career.
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring it up is because I find that the material, the basis of this film from 1948 is a unique one in that it's based on a play, a Broadway play, not of the same name. The Broadway play is called Joan of Lorraine. And in some ways, this movie, the 1948 movie, is like a direct product of that play. And I mean that because according to the play, what the play is about is it's very metafictional. It's about a group of actors and producers and directors, basically the production team of a Broadway play called Joan of Arc, and how the way that the play that they're portraying, the play that they're putting on affects each one of them, like the characters that they take on. And so way ahead of its time as far as storytelling. I mean, this is something that Man of La Mancha would do about 15 years later in the 60s. Telling the story of Don Quixote, but also, how it was made. And then they made that into a movie, similar idea. That whole idea of just metafiction, of like us being immersed into a story that's in a story itself, is, I imagine that was probably difficult to do on stage, but maybe even difficult for audiences to look at and understand completely. And Ingrid Bergman played that character. She played both the actress playing Joan of Arc and Joan of Arc in that. And so when I watch the movie 1948's Joan of Arc, I can't help but recognize that the opening credits look a lot like a playbill, that it's broken down into acts. And it's not the first movie to do that. In fact, Victor Fleming's 1939 masterpiece Gone with the Wind does something very similar too, where they give you, all the scenes ahead of time. This is, at Tara, at, all the, in Atlanta, all the different scenes that you're going to see, and then give you the cast of characters that way. But it seems to fit this a little bit more because it was a play. So this is almost like, to me, to wrap things up, the idea is like this movie from 1948 is what the play was working on in 1946, that this is like, they were building up to this. And I just think that's very forward for the time period.
It's very interesting. And for Bergman, she has a long history of working in theaters as well. She got her breakthrough in Sweden working at what would probably be translated to the Royal Theatre. And it's from there that she got onto the movie scene. So for her, I read her biography a while ago, and she actually gives a lot of credit to Victor Fleming for this movie because it brings her back to her roots.
Victor Fleming, like you mentioned, this is his. It turns out to be his last movie. He passes away within a year after its release, but he was there from the beginning in Hollywood. He was making movies as early as 1916, 1917, silent pictures. He therefore was part of that first generation of filmmakers that were really inventing as they went. They were not following in anybody. There was no other footsteps to follow in. It was just them making this new art form, this new media form. And so he, you know, despite that, he still makes these incredible pictures. In just 1 year, 1939, he directs both The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, which both those films are usually up there as being like considered in the top 10 greatest movies of all time. And so it's like within 10 years after that, he makes a lot of other movies that aren't quite as epic in proportion. So it seems like this is a fitting story to be the last, gift he gives to the viewing public, is this sweeping epic, this story of a figure, like you said, that has been in the lexicon of Western civilization since the 15th century. And so it kind of matches up well. It'd be a shame if his last picture was like a buddy comedy or something and wouldn't really match up quite where it should be. And so it's, I think, telling of the time period that here's a director that, made it through, 2 world wars as far as his craft, survived the changeover from silent picture to talkies, revolutionized how things are done with Technicolor. That's another part of the material that this was made from. And his last hurrah is this sweeping epic of Joan of Arc. So what does all that, what do you pull from that as far as the time period, 75 years ago, all of this information that we have so far, what it's made from, how it was made, who made it, where are we, what can we look at and say, all right, that's something about the late 1940s that we can work with?
I mean, we are in the early 50s and late 40s. We are in a stage where we are looking for heroes in the movie industry. And this, both in historical dramas, but also in the early, like in quotation marks, superhero market that will arrive at the same time. And if anything, these movies, these great period dramas, are the stories of these heroes that are, and to be honest, it's quite a safe play. As I said, we've been using her for 500 years, and every time it's Joan of Arc, it will be a success. So if he had a sense that he might be going out soon, this might be the last thing he does, it was a very smart move.
And reflective, like you said, of the post-World War II era.
Very much so.
And it connects people, at least European people, to the United States. It's, this figure that, of course, is very French. And in some ways, when we look at Joan of Arc herself, she is, as of the time of this movie, only recently canonized as a saint. She's actually, 1920, which I don't know if there's a coincidence there or not, but in this country, 1920 is when the 19th Amendment, which guarantees women's right to vote, had been ratified, and that in itself is a product of World War One, because of, it's not just World War One, but all the work of the suffrage movement, but then World War One and women's contribution to that war, both in the home front and overseas, really confirms that, and makes Congress and the president, President Wilson, stood behind the idea, let's do this for the women. This is, the least we can do is let them be enfranchised into systems. So that's 1920, the exact same year that Joan of Arc is given that title of saint, and becomes very quickly, therefore, the symbol of France. One of the, France's, uh, uh, kind of patron saint. And they just, and I know that France is, very much the centerpiece of both world wars, but I always feel like World War One is more the French War,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. I mean, do you think I'm weird with that, or is that
No, that makes perfect sense. It's World War One. That's the battle for France.
right?
We had people dying on the Western Front. That didn't happen in the same way in World War Two. To simplify it, it was more a quick battle. They gave up, and then
Mhm.
we had a split France with two governments. Both were Nazis.
Right. And
Yeah.
and I realized that the end of World War One is what contributes to the beginning of World War Two, with the Germans, reclaiming the lands that they'd lost, um, with the Treaty of Versailles. But it's like, yeah, the everything, like all the symbology, even in the United States, a lot of the post-war imagery, or even during the war, a lot of the posters trying to encourage support for the conflict and American involvement in it have very French looks to them. Or the famous story of General Pershing arriving to the crypt of the Marquis de Lafayette and saying, "Marquis, we have returned, you helped us, and now we're here to help you." And then you're right, although the liberation of France comes in World War II, that's like not really until the end of the conflict. You don't see it the same way. Most of the major fighting after the battle for Normandy is, the Battle of the Bulge tends to take a lot more of the interest, and then it's the Eastern Front that really squeezes the Germans into surrendering by the end of the war. France doesn't have quite the same presence in that conflict.
No, and because of the fact that the Nazis controlled most of Europe, it was more of the freeing Europe than freeing France,
right?
In the way we look at it.
And so therefore it's almost as like this movie was a bit late, that it probably, and who knows, I mean, again, it's based on a play that came out also after World War II, but it's almost like it was on the shelf. It was being waited. It was somebody was waiting to make this, to make the latest. And I am sure if we looked into, in silent picture era, there's a lot of movies that just like vanished. They never did anything with. And I feel that there's most likely a silent picture Joan of Arc, probably a French film that they made or something from the 20s, or maybe even a little bit earlier. But as far as this Hollywood production of it, it's like, well, we couldn't have given it justice back in the 1920 or 21, but now we can do it now, 1948. And like you said, this is a globe. It's a part of the world that's, the entire globe is looking for people to follow after, but women in particular. Women, men had their idols. I mean, look at all the war heroes that World War II produced. Men had plenty to, and they themselves could come back home and give their war stories. And the American economy, at least, was by 1948 bustling with activity because of the Second World War. So many of those veterans came home with skill sets that they didn't have before the conflict, and applying them to making a very efficient economy, one that was producing when war-torn Europe, including France, is unable to. And we are basically the sole provider for so many of manufactured goods for that part of the world. So it's like, this might go along with that idea of, all right, women also contributed to this entire thing. Rosie the Riveter, even if it's just her, not a real person, but just the women in the factories. Now when we make a movie a couple years later, this is, Joan of Arc was the 15th century version of what you just did. Does that seem to work in your way of thinking too?
No, it does. It does to some extent. Uh, the fact that, as you're saying, the women played a large part of the war as well, and I feel like a lot of them, reading at the source at the time, feels that way as well. They feel like we made a big difference. We stepped up and make sure that the home front kept rolling. So I think it's a great demand for these female heroes as well. Looking at Cleopatra, we have 3 movies about Cleopatra being published within, well, the late 40s and the early 50s. So it's a lot of figures from history that they are using to give these women a voice. It had to be advertised as the last great work of Victor Fleming.
I'm sure that's
it had to be.
I'm sure, and I was actually, when I looked at the Internet Movie Database entry for Joan of Arc, the pictures that come up, the photographs, there's a whole bunch of photos of modern actors and actresses at some kind of premiere. Names like Winona Ryder and Jennifer Tilly. Why would these people be at this thing? Turns out it was a 50th anniversary presentation of it. So Hollywood loves this. They embrace it. But what is it about this film that you think may have fallen flat for the actual viewing audiences?
My best guess is that there were so many great movies coming out in that span of time. Between 1946 and 1956, the movie industry had a great boom after the war. There were many good movies coming out, and let's face it, looking at the first edit, it's quite long-running movie. It's it's not that much action, and so I don't think it's easy to answer that question.
Well, you can kind of, I get a little bit of clue when I was watching it, and the way that they do the explanation of things. With this one, it's American actors, minus Ingrid Bergman, who are giving the exposition ahead of time and talking about the English and the Burgundians and how, and it's almost like at that moment you're probably losing a lot of people. They're like, I don't even know, like, Burgundy is a color to me. I don't understand, why should I care about Burgundians? That it, at least in the United States, it probably just had to be reduced to a lot more simpler terms. And I think in a way you're almost running a risk here because as soon after the Second World War as this came out, yes, it does depict one of the allies as front and center of this, but the other ally, and in fact probably the more important ally to the United States, is the bad guys in this, in the English. And so it's like, I think it was probably like the general story itself was what gravitated Victor Fleming and the entire production to make this, but the audiences might not have been ready for it just yet, or been interested in it. And it was a little bit harder. It's like, we just got through, the second one of these world wars, because, the 100-Year War is basically, the medieval end of the medieval period and their version of a world war. We just got through 2 of these in about 30 to 40 years, where we have to keep all these different factions straight and, all this stuff. Do we have time do we have the energy to go through it again in this movie and try to figure out who we care about and why in this epic film? It's a dilemma that maybe viewing audiences weren't really interested in trying to solve.
Yeah, and it doesn't help that Bergman became persona non grata the next year, as she had the affair with Rossellini. because
Yeah.
in 1949 Ingrid Bergman had an affair with the director Roberto Rossellini, which led to her, well, leaving the US because it was too hard to deal with the publicity around it.
Hmm.
Uh, so that might have played a role as well, that she, like the main character of the movie, became this, well, pretty much persona non grata.
And it that says something also too about the role that movies are playing in people's lives. And you mentioned at the very beginning of this that this is where Western civilization, I would say even global civilization, was turning to for moral guidance, to learn what was right, what was wrong. And even though she might be literally portraying a saint in a movie, if somebody's discretion's outside of the movies, which the tabloids had been around as long as there had been movies, were portraying her that way. I feel like in much of the world, especially here in the United States, that post-war era was a very conservative one. People were hoping to uh, have a lot more, um, just moral compass, and that we're going to lead nice, good, clean lives. There was an awareness, even as early as 1948, of the United States being the vanguard, or the hegemon in Western culture, and the Soviet Union being, the evil that we were dealing with, and that what we do in our part of the world is going to say something about us. And so, therefore, celebrities. I mean, this is also the same time period of Hollywood being investigated by the House for Un-American Activities committee, and McCarthyism is really starting to pick up because of that awareness of, like, this is what the power the movies have. Do you think that there is a significance of putting this movie out on November 11th? And just to remind everybody here in the United States, November 11th wasn't called Veterans Day here until a few years after this. I think about 8 years after this, in the 1950s, is when a holiday specific to just veterans of any military service are honored on that. Before that, it was along the same lines as what Europe has always celebrated, which is Armistice Day. Do you think there's a significance of the 30th anniversary of the armistice that ultimately ended the First World War as the day that Joan of Arc comes out?
Yes, probably. Short answer is yeah, probably it did. And not only because, I mean, for the obvious reasons, it's a movie about the protection of France, etc., etc., but also because it's a great way to market the movie, to put it out in connection with this. It's a smart move there as well, because I would assume that people would make these connections in the media at the time, which also would lead to more eyes getting pulled towards the movie.
Which I think probably also speaks to who the intended audience was.
Yeah.
That they were hoping. I feel like people, just ordinary folk, were a lot more aware of those kinds of symbols back then.
Yeah.
And it's. I know that I sometimes I recognize in culture, presently and for the last several years, that a lot of people are very reactive to social media or even something as simple as what the calendar reads, but not super interested in the actual like roots. And that's where like a Instagram account like yours is very helpful, because it explains why we do things or why certain days are important, or people beyond just the superficial of like, oh, there's a guy, or in this case a woman, that did something at some point. That the educational systems, the expectations of adults to be aware of history, in of course recent history, and for 1948, there's a pretty good chance that there's a lot of people still very much alive from 1918 that are like, oh yeah, it's not like a strange thing that we'd have this French, heroine of France being recognized in movie form 30 years to the day after the great armistice that essentially kept that country alive years later. So yeah, it says something a lot, I think, about the general population. I get frustrated sometimes because I feel that we're both history teachers, so maybe you feel the same way about this, that it might have everything to do with just people being overwhelmed with so much information. But I kind of get annoyed when you have to explain what I always thought was like essential knowledge. You have to give like a backstory to every single thing in history, when I would say maybe 75 years ago, uh, the way that people were taught and they learned things, it was just kind of common knowledge. Like you didn't have to, and you weren't necessarily a historian. It was just like, yeah, I know this. I know, the significance of, this particular date because I learned it in school, and I learned it as early as like fourth grade or something like that. Like, or even some things outside of history, like, basic engineering or mathematics or science. It was just kind of like a standard. This is what everybody knows this. You don't need to have this big build up to it, this full explanation. Do you feel that education standards were remarkably different 75 plus years ago, that may have made it so this kind of movie would just kind of be part of the overall atmosphere, that it wouldn't necessarily need a lot of like supplements to explain what it's all about?
If we put it this way, if we would publish a movie about Joan of Arc the same date this year, almost nobody would make the connection. Not even in the papers, not even the people making a review about it would make that connection. But back in those days, it was, well, as you said, common knowledge. And people would understand that, okay, it's being published this date because of this. But that might also be helped by, as you also said, people who participated in the First World War were still alive. Those memorial days were more alive during that time, because we could actually see the people that participated in the war. As of now, the memory of the end of the First World War is just a historical date. We don't have much more connection to it than that. And slowly the end of the Second World War is becoming the same thing, because we almost don't have any people participating in that war left either.
And that one actually is even a little bit even more difficult to figure out the actual ending. I mean, both conflicts honestly didn't actually end anything. There's, they always say it's the First World War, the war to end all wars, but like immediately after, there's civil wars, there's other incursions throughout Europe. It didn't really end much. It just ended on paper that particular conflict between those different belligerents. And with World War II, it's you have VE Day and then VJ Day, and one's in May, one's in August, and it's like when those days come up, a lot of like you said, like even Pearl Harbor Day, December 7th, is not on every calendar. It's not on people's minds. It's a footnote at the end of the news broadcast nowadays, if anything. Over the weekend, my son was given a calendar, like a pocket calendar thing, and he was filling it out, and it came from the Disabled American Veterans Organization. So, of course, all the holidays that are on there are references either to military type recognitions or government holidays. Like like Constitution Day was on there, Bill of Rights Day was on there, Pearl Harbor Day was on there, and we've become such. And I think that's a product of just like the how niche our society has become. People are like, well, I'm interested in this, so that's the only thing I'm going to surround myself with, and I'll be like super knowledgeable about this one thing or this one variety of things, and you can do that without even leaving a computer. You can just become like an expert, a self-taught expert on one particular way of life or one part of life, and like that's the go-to. If we have any questions about war stuff, we're going to go to you because you know it all. But then you go back and you say, well, so well, I don't know anything about anything else. But like if you go back in time to 75 years, not only because of the direct connection of people who are alive that we can point to, but I just think that was much more of we didn't have that super hyper focused single-mindedness in the 1940s, and definitely not prior to that you would have that would come out later on than that. Does that kind of thing exist in Europe presently, where people are like hyper focused on one thing and not so much on other disciplines?
I think that's an international phenomena.
Okay.
Yeah, very much. But it's also interesting because you come from a country that has a great connection to both these wars. I don't. In the same way, Sweden, of course, has a connection to it, but they did not participate directly in either the First or the Second World War. Mm-hmm. So looking back in history, we don't have any special days for the end of the wars. We do not have any great traumas in connection to these wars, which I also think has shaped the way that we look at, 20th century history in Sweden specifically. It's a way more complicated era in that way that we don't really have these strong dates, these strong events that we can connect things to.
Any kind of effect that you would see as either we're better off because of that or we're lacking because of that?
No, I think that our understanding and our debate about history here has become worse because of that. Because what we say, or what the average history knowledge person here says, is that, well, we didn't participate in the war, so why should we talk about it? While we did participate, just not with soldiers. Mm-hmm. We sent soldiers to Finland. We had German troops moving through, during the Second World War, moving through Sweden by train. We sent resources to Nazi Germany. And as soon as they started to lose the war, we switched sides and loved the Allies instead. And that's a discussion that people don't take as much. They instead just simplify it to, well, we didn't participate, so why should we talk about it?
I want to say that the atomic age that 1948 was definitely in the early parts of contribute in a lot of ways to people being less interested in nuance and less interested in gray areas, like you were just describing. Italy's behavior during actually both world wars, but definitely the First World War, is really hard to explain if you're looking at things only in black and white. And like we were just describing Sweden's participation in the Second World War, I mean, it's all geographic. I mean, everything can be explained by where Sweden is in regards to the rest of Europe,
Yeah.
as to why they may have done what they did as far as the participation goes. But that doesn't fit the consciousness of the atomic age, where everything is good or bad, and therefore World War II is that much easier to figure out, and World War One is still complex to explain to that mentality of it's either good or it's evil. It's nothing in between. It's this gray areas don't really work out well in that atomic age. They're back again. I mean, I would say the 21st century has a lot of gray area anti-hero type. A lot of people celebrate that because the way things have arrived in the post Cold War era. But yeah, in those days, for most of the 20th century, yeah, that I could see why that doesn't really fit most people's ability to understand. It's like it's so much easier when you're like, here it is. It's just lay it out for you, which makes me wonder. And I just kind of thought of this as I continue to have this movie on, if there's any kind of pacifist message, maybe not necessarily pacifist, because war is the centerpiece of Joan of Arc. It's what she's being considered to be this icon because of what she did in the war with England and the Burgundians. But it's like, I wonder for a post World War II audience, and again, this may be even more appropriate for World War One, this is why we should be happy that we've never had a monarchy in this country and nobilities, because the way that succession can cause the death of thousands in combat, where the ordinary, the peasant class is not even, they get nothing out of it other than terrible things happen for the ordinary foot soldier in these conflicts, that they're not knights. They're not, Joan of Arc is one of them until she has this premonition that allows for her to rise very rapidly. But here's the world of kings and nobles and all these, it's just so alien, and it's been romanticized before and since then, but it might also be as a way to confirm, here's why we don't participate in the United States and never have. And in Europe, it's a fading practice as of 1948, that, you might have monarchs, but they're very much just figureheads. They don't actually have any real political power. And in a way, it's like, now that this part of the Atlantic is the leader of the free world, of, we have that role that we've taken on, whether we like it or not. We need to be very careful not to involve ourselves in these antiquated ways of deciding who to fight with and for. That might be just me going too far deep into it, but with all the scenes beyond the battle scenes where you see kneeling and talking and getting, the favor of the royals and stuff like that, I kind of wonder if there's anything to that as far as a, post World War II and, even post World War One idea of, like, just pushing forward that concept of, like, let's not involve ourselves in the way that Europe has always gone to war, because most wars in Europe's history are for that reason. It's, somebody loses their place on a throne, and, a bunch of people died to figure out who's next.
Yeah, and as you say that, the scene with the crowning in the church moves up on my screen here, and all I can think about is it also has a bit of a silliness to it. looking at
Mhm.
it from an American standpoint, I can imagine that viewing this scene, it's almost next to like just being silly, like Joan kneeling by the feet of the monarch, they having 5 people put down the crown,
Yeah.
they have moved. It just looks silly, and that's also might also be it might also be a point in that this is a thing from an older world that we have moved away from in the late 1940s.
Yeah. And I know that there is, and not as much anymore, but it has long been a fascination with royalty and monarchies and the way they conduct themselves. I remember teaching, and I currently teach a medieval European history class, which I'm not entirely sure I'm super equipped to teach it, but I enjoy teaching it just because some of these ideas of compare and contrast between, uh, the United States and antiquated Europe. But there's been a fascination with that because we don't have it, right? So like when Queen Elizabeth II was crowned in the 50s and was televised, American audiences were just as enthralled with the idea, and we're like, why do they do that? What's the deal with, why do they have that entire, one of the most popular shows on Netflix is her story, The Crown, where they, people, we're just kind of like, well, we don't have that, so we're interested in why they do those things. I had a student one time say, well, we like it because it's almost like fairy tales come true. We have all the Disney princesses, and we have, those stories that uh, are out of reach for us because we don't have official nobility in our country, but therefore we kind of put it in that, Game of Thrones, Disney, you name it, like fantasy world, where it's a real fantasy world for us. Like, wow, so the king of Great Britain, Charles, he was a prince, and then he went through this, time period where he was just the king, but then he got his coronation, and it's like, and then before that when his sons got married, and then the whole drama with his Harry going off, is he a prince anymore? It's in our tabloids just as much as it is in Britain's. And I'm curious if that's also kind of churning around the same time this movie comes out, that it's in there, that there is this interest that didn't exist before because of those connections that were made during the Second World War, where so many Americans went overseas. My uncle is a product of that. Like, his mother's English, his father's American, and it's like that was, that close relationship, particularly with Britain, but the other Western powers as well. I wonder if that's kind of the origin place of Americans having a deep interest in the way that European, crowns of Europe have been created and passed down, and this movie might be pointing at the frivolity of all of that and be like, just here's our way of entering into that conversation. Be like, okay, don't be too enamored with it because it looks stupid. Somebody kneeling down and
We
and
wouldn't
going through all
want
this
it,
ceremony.
but I mean, it looks cool.
Yeah, and I think people like that idea, but I remember a poll at one point came out. It's like 80% of Americans would love to speak with a British accent, but not actually be British. We have that. I mean, it's even it's in the Great Gatsby. This idea of like, you keep going west, or excuse me, east, to seek out your approval. Like, it's the old world is still watching the new world and instructing it in some ways. I think a lot of people don't understand the importance of the Hundred Years' War in European history, and I would say even global history, because the end of that conflict, 1453 is a red letter year in a lot of ways. It's the end of the Hundred Years' War. And that war produced the introduction, and they show in the movie, of gunpowder, firearms entering, which is the great leveler of people. And then you have, coming out of that, a renaissance in Europe, which is also a great social revolution where, the peasant class is starting to fade away and people are moving into the cities, and it's no longer about what your last name is or that you pass down this. Business people are becoming famous and important because of their prowess and their support of the arts, and it's like all of that really takes a huge the conflict that this movie is showing, it all stems from that particular conflict. So yeah, it might be a bit of a history lesson as well as a commentary on modern times for the population watching it.
No, and I don't think people understand how important the end of this war was. As you said, it's the end of nobility. For 1,000 years, nobility has, like the noble class, has ruled Europe. And first off, with the increase of rich people moving into the cities, like a trader class, like people becoming rich in other ways, but also the end of the night. Gunpowder, as well as the longbow, became the end of the night, which in turn also led to, like, the noble families not being as important for the kings anymore in providing soldiers to fight their wars, which led to the kings being stronger and the noble class being weaker, which also opened up for the regular man. And we had the end of we had the Black Death. We had that killed off a third of Europe, almost up to half of Europe, which in turn led to an abundance of land. So the nobles couldn't keep their peasants working on their farms. They could just move to the next one. There was so much happening in this time that led to an entirely reshaping of society in Europe.
And let's not mention also the invention of the printing press.
Yeah.
Happened the exact same year, 1453. And eventually, if you were to follow the line of reasoning on that one, gets us to Hollywood. You're able to broadcast ideas. The book and the printed word is probably up there with the wheel as far as like the important revolutionary things in human history. So I think in our conversation today, we just perhaps explained all the reasons why people should be Joan of Arc aficionados.
Very much so.
People should love this movie a lot more than it gets appreciated. I still think it must be, in my own movie going and movie viewing favors or preferences. Just this last weekend, we had a chance to go see the movies, and we had to make a choice between the Martin Scorsese film that just came out and the movie Priscilla, and I was like, it all comes down to, I'm interested in both topics. I'm both interested in both movies, but it came down to the one that's under 2 hours. I think the Scorsese one is pushing 3 hours long. And I'm like, I just can't sit in a theater that long. I'll go with Another King and his queen, Priscilla Presley's story, which clocked in at about an hour and 45 minutes. That's a little bit more reasonable. I still go back to that. I'm like, I think the length of this thing is potentially, because back in 1939, when you make Gone with the Wind and it has an intermission, people have nothing but time. They're like, hey, I'll go see a movie and stay here for all day. I don't care. By 1948, it's a different world. People aren't as interested in spending half their day at the movie theater, watching a sweeping epic. So, if they were to remake this nowadays, probably be episodic. We'd probably have it on streaming somewhere, and it could be even longer technically. But I appreciate you taking your time today, Johan, and talking about this with me and seeing what it can tell us about 75 years ago. Before we depart, if you could remind everybody where they can find you online and be edutained.
You can find me on Edutainment Daily on Instagram and on TikTok as of now. So yeah, that's the two places, and more is to come in the near future, but you have to follow me on Instagram to know about that.
All right. And I know I do, and about 10,000 other people do as well. So congratulations on that. That's a lot of influence that you have in a great way, because I think you're using the internet as it should be used, as a way to entertain and educate at the same time. And thank you all for listening today, and to the EPS podcast, where everything, including 1948's Joan of Arc, is a primary source. We'll talk to you